Welcome back. In Module 4, we're going to spend some time looking at how to create ELL profiles so we can better understand the students that we find sitting in front of us in class. Knowing where students come from and more about them personally and educationally is going to be very important for us to know how to begin working with students, and from there we'll really be able to make some progress in helping them reach the goals we have for all the students in our class. I want you to do a quick thing for us. The first thing is to get a scrap piece of paper and just write your name at the center of the paper, and then circle your name. So after you have your paper and write your name, we want you to create a fast graffiti write, sort of a web, just describing yourself. Just write things about your family information, your strengths, your weaknesses, things that you like or dislike, and other things that you might find important to you as a person. So pause the recording for a few minutes to write these things down. Okay, now, think and consider if I'd asked you the question to write these things as you were going to write for a professional profile that you would maybe present to an interview team for a position you were trying to get a job for. Now, add some more details to your personal profile, to your graffiti write. So again, pause the recording for a moment. And as you pause the recording and write some more things, also consider this. How does the phrasing of the prompt affect what you wrote for each of the two parts? The one that was more personal, and this one here that's a bit more professional and academic. So consider those things as you take a few minutes to write. Let's take a look at 3 essential questions dealing with English language learner profiles. First off, what's the purpose of doing these in the first place? The activity we just performed, looking at your own profile, was to sort of show you that there's 2 aspects that we want to look into. 2 reasons why we're doing this. Number 1, we need to understand these students socially and from their language background, and we need to know information about their lives and their likes and dislikes. But it's also important for us to have an idea and understanding of the academic side of that student, the more professional things we could talk about and learn about in order to be able to serve them the best way we can in a really full-orbed way. The second question is, who's the intended audience? And here we're really talking about an audience of professionals, teachers, and staffers who are directly connected with working with a student. ESL teachers, content teachers, administrators, people like that, counselors, even psychologists, depending. And there might be some things on an ELL profile that are a bit sensitive, so it's very important for us not to share things in context that don't necessarily apply to the benefit of this student. And the third question is where we're going to head into next, is what are the components of a good ELL profile? What are the things that we should include to really understand these students? So we have 7 major components that we're going to look at in detail on a slide apiece to learn about different components of what we really need to know to help us in understanding an ESOL student. The first component of the profile is their academic achievement. We need to look at some past assessment data to learn about the academic success of this student since they've gotten to our district. What are their previous grades and what kind of courses were they enrolled in? And how's their classroom performance? Does the teacher make comments about their conduct or other issues to that extent? So what are some of the academic things we can learn about them? A second component of the ELL profile is a learning environment. And here we're talking about the setting of your actual classroom, the physical space. One issue might be the preferential seating of an ESL student. Sometimes seating a student near the front and the center gives you a better chance of seeing how they're working and what they're understanding and what maybe they're not understanding. Just having them closer, that proximity is very important. Some students, maybe because of ADHD or various other issues, might have a strong reaction to class stimuli, and you need to understand issues like that to know to put them in places or settings that are going to be most conducive for their learning environment. And also, the student's previous schooling and the setting of their classroom is very important, especially if students maybe weren't born in the United States of America and now they're here coming from a different environment. For example, if they used to be in a class of 50 to 80 students all lined up in rows listening to a teacher talk for several hours and having their teachers actually rotate into that classroom, not that students move from class to class, they're going to be quite surprised by our changes of class by the bells, and they're also going to be very confused when we put them into groups to work collaboratively, which is something they have probably very little experience with. So, learning environment and the physical setting of your classroom is a very important component of this profile. A third component for us to consider are personal and family issues. Things to consider might be how much time has this student spent in the United States? Were they born and raised here? Or were they just arrived in the past year or two? Socioeconomic issues are very important for us to understand as well. With all the recent brain research about the effects of poverty on children, it's very important for us to consider this. And many times our students are coming from non-American backgrounds where the poverty is much more severe than it even is here. Their neighborhood and physical address might be important for us to understand and put them in a context of where they're coming from outside of the school day. Their housing stability. Are they living with another family, their whole family? Or are there many students living together with a couple of families in a trailer? Or do they have their own apartment or even their own single family house? Knowing about the parents is also very important. Do they live with the mother and the father, or an aunt and uncle, or maybe even a distant relative? And what's the kind of work situation for that family? Are both employed, or is there only one parent employed? Or maybe perhaps are there times when no one in the home has a job and it might influence the student? The parent's level of education is also a very crucial thing for us to find out, especially the level of the mother's education, which is very important in the development of her children. Considering things like siblings and birth order are also very important. Have we worked with this student's older brother or sister, or do they have younger siblings coming up that sometimes they may even have to not be able to be part of tutoring programs after school because they're going home to take care of their younger siblings? And also things just as simple as their likes and dislikes. Knowing things of this personal nature are really going to help us in working with our kids. A fourth component is their previous schooling. What was their school attendance like in their home country? Were there lots of gaps for perhaps months or years during teacher strikes or limited access to public schooling? Or were they in a private school that was actually maybe on the same status as a school in America would be? What was the format of that schooling? Did they attend during the same hours of the day or the same times of the year during the different seasons? Was it a year-long schooling or something different? Preschool attendance is very important for us to know, and obviously, if they've been here in the States and were born here, they've probably been connected to preschool. So having that kind of knowledge is really going to help us, especially at the elementary grades. Considering retentions as well. Students sometimes come to us having been retained by another country, another state, and we want to know when that was and why that was, because it's illegal to retain a student based on their language proficiency, and we know that some districts and states do this and have done this in the past, but we want to be sure here in our district that we're not retaining students based on their language abilities. But maybe there was a viable retention for some other reason, so let's look into why that happened. Absences and tardies are also very important. Does a student have a track record of missing lots of days? Why is that? And can we help to solve that problem? And tardies. What are the things that have included in that? And also, are there any truancy issues with a student? A fifth component we need to understand when looking at an ELL profile is their actual English proficiency level, which can include things such as their oral language, their social language, and also things like literacy factors and their reading and writing abilities. One major grouping of things we need to look at here is their L1 or their first language ability. How strong was a student academically in the language they came from? Many students come to us having gaps in formal education, and their level of their first language is actually quite low, whereas other people might come in at a level even higher than the average student at their grade here in America. A second category of tests we can look at if the student has been here for at least a couple of months or a couple of years are their DRA and DIBELS levels, their MAP Lexile range, or things like state assessments. They're also great places to look in the third category are the actual English language proficiency tests, such as a screener like the WAP that we would give when students first enroll, or tests like the ELDA or Access, where the scores can be used and broken up into the subtests to help us know how good the student is performing in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. These are all three great ways to find out about a student's proficiency level. There's also some cross-cultural considerations we should see in building our profiles. What are the differences in educational settings from this student? As we mentioned before, is there a big difference in the class size or what the school building looks like? Many times the actual space that we have is quite confusing and disconcerting to students who may have come from a background where the school is just one room. Their attire and their attitudes. What are things we need to consider in these students and helping them to understand our dress codes and the attitudes we have towards school? What are some things we need to understand about this student's cultural that they came from to be able to help us? Many cultures have different ideas about gender and the different roles that genders should play and the sexes should play. So we need to understand that. Making judgment calls based on what we assume a student thinks is often not a very good idea, because many times they might have differing perspectives on the importance of education. We assume that all students want to do well in education, where some cultures where students are coming from might feel that they would rather leave school at the age of 13 to go get a job because that's what they were planning on doing in their home country. And many times we have to battle this with the parents as well, and them not seeing the importance of a student going all the way through and completing their high school career and graduating. So parent expectation is a very important thing in dealing with students, because how the parents have built the culture of the home is going to be where the students most likely are going to come from when they arrive to our schools. So we need to carefully consider how to help the parents to understand why we feel education is so important for their family and for their future. Maybe not in the immediate day in, day out of survival, but in the future for the longevity of that student's success in their education and their career and into the rest of their personal life. And even things as foundationally cultural as food and eating habits are things we need to consider. Is a student perhaps a Muslim and is not allowed to eat pork products? Things like that, dealing with how to help a student through the lunch line, might be very important for us to deal with. The seventh and final component of our ELL profile are the physical and psychological issues. We consider things here like their general health, including things like their hearing, their vision, and dental issues, which many times can be barriers to a student performing well in the classroom. We want to be sure that even where the student has come from might not have considered these things, that we are considering them. And the social and developmental information that we can gather from the family and from their previous schooling to understand where the student has come from and how well they fit in physically and psychologically to the school setting in the past. Have there been any past psychological screenings done in another country or state that might inform us, or even here when they arrived in our district, what are some things that have been done to help us get a better understanding of where the student's at? And again, some of this information could be quite sensitive and confidential, so we want to make sure that it's only in the hands of people who are actually working with a student that will be impacted by knowing this information. Many of these students have been impacted from their arrival situations and the backgrounds they bring, and even their current living situations. Many of them have faced abuse and trauma in arriving here in the States, or maybe have been in countries in the world coming as immigrants who were treated quite poorly as an ethnicity or as a tribe in the place they've come from. And so we need to understand the impact that this student is bringing from all those things that can oftentimes be quite a bit of baggage for them to deal with. And speaking of the connections to resources, knowing about these physical and psychological things, have we been able to try to connect them to resources that are really going to help them to excel, both in their life academically and their life socially? Now, let's consider the question, what does this profile really need to look like? In our district, we don't have a set form of what an ELL profile would look like, and a lot of the information we find that we've looked at in these 7 components can be found in places like Enrich or in PowerSchool, or other places like Student Files and the cumulative folder or the permanent records. But some of it is more passed down from person to person through conversations and things like that based on sensitive natures of some of the information. So as we look at a couple of examples of what a profile might look like if it was on paper, consider this as a stepping stone and just giving an idea of where to start. Here's one example created by some folks in the state. They have a picture of the student, and including their full name, a couple of anecdotal notes, and the teacher they're working with right now, and their classroom teacher. There's a section for demographic information and their English language proficiency level. There's a great place for them to write some things in about the student's background, of where they've come from, and things that might help us to understand them more. There's a few things else on there about the assessments and the interest of the student, and maybe there's some other things if the student is a part of a different program like special ed or has a 504 that we could also make mention of here. If they're a part of RTI or gifted and talented, there's just a little space down there to jot those things down. Here's another example where you might put the student's photo in the middle and have some of that same information just kind of scattered around the page as it goes. Sometimes it's even fun to have a student help build their own profile. Obviously, again, remembering the sensitive information shouldn't go on this paper, but there's things here that a teacher could learn a lot from having the student fill out this form for themselves. So consider this maybe as a class activity if you're an ESL teacher or a content teacher, so you can learn more about your ESL student, and really, honestly, this would help with learning about any student in your classroom. Okay, so as we get together in our group activity when we're face-to-face, we're going to recall the 7 components of this profile, and we're going to be sharing with our partner about some reflections we've had on creating our own profile. And so to be able to do that when we get in the group together, you'll need to take some time on the individual assignment to create your own student profile. We're guessing this will take you about an hour. So what we want you to do is select one ESOL student and do some research and maybe an interview with the student, and then compile that data together. And create a one-page profile when the format is totally up to you, and you don't have to include a picture, but you can write it or type it up or use one of the examples that were provided in the last 2 slides. Just remembering to be very careful with the sensitive information that might not need to be put out there to the whole world. So, here's your individual assignment. We hope you have success in it, and then we'll have a good time discussing your student and what you learned about them in building this profile.